We're here about the lighthouse history of the North Shore, how it came to be. It started in the Mobile, early 1700s, and 100 years later was established by a family, the Krebs family, over on the mouth of the Tchefuncte River. I've been doing history for many years. I started in 1960 when I was about 30, and my father just retired from the railroad, and he had a Bible, a short Bible, and as I was teaching in California, when I'd come during the summer, he would pull out the Bible and ask me, what are these people's names? What are they doing? Do we know anything about them? And I said, where did this start? He said, across the lake at Madisonville. The causeway was just finished a few years back, so I decided to take a drive over there, and that started my interest in the history of the North Shore. Over the years, I've acquired many different topics. I started researching history of the North Shore. North Shore is a part of the Florida parishes, which includes St. Tammany, Tangipahoa, and Washington Parish. I started doing the family tree, and then after the family tree, I started to get interested in the first people that were settled there, and that led from one thing to the other. And over the years, I collected a lot of material. But about 20 years ago, I was using the computer and doing something, trying to find out something about the Lemoyne brothers, Pierre Iberville and his brother Bienville, when I came across some pictures. It's in my book here, number 14, volume number 14. And I was interested because they were old maps that were printed in Paris in 1718, and on the maps it was the Mobile Bay and Dolphin Island, Oyster Point, and I looked there and it said Lighthouse. There were a lighthouse at the west end of Dolphin Island and one off Oyster Point. And I said, 1718, by the time they did the maps and drew them and sent them over, that would be several years earlier. And I said, I just read an article in the paper where Brewster Island in Massachusetts, in Boston Harbor, was the oldest lighthouse system in United States history. And that was in 1716. I said to myself, I have to look into this. This could be much earlier, a system that started within the continental limits of the United States. We have a prospect of the lighthouse system on the Gulf Coast being the oldest in American history territory. And the start of the story begins with Iberville and landing on the shore of the Gulf Coast. He found the entrance to the Mississippi, and he made a little trip through there, and he named the lakes. He came back, he went up the river, and he came back through the lakes, and he named them Lake Pontchartrain and Count Pontchartrain's son Maurepas, so the two lakes. And this is the beginning of the story. But on this, going into the history of Bienville and Iberville, Iberville leaves and Bienville takes over, and he decides to establish the first settlement above Mobile Bay on the river 27 miles up past Mobile Bay. And this is where the story begins. This story, by the way, the history of the lighthouse system, is not only about a mechanical development, but it's also about families and how the families participated, and it wound, and we're going to take it step by step and see how the lighthouse at the mouth of the Tchefuncte River was, when it was established and by whom. When Iberville landed at the Gulf Coast, he had a stone made, chiseled. He had the stone made, Pierre Bien, Iberville, France, and so forth. And he buried it, which is the place called Ocean Springs, Mississippi. And it stayed in that ground for years and years. And then a lighthouse keeper named Frederick Schaefer, I have his name here. He was one of the last lighthouse keepers, Frederick Schneider, from 1920 to 1939, 19 years. His father-in-law lived at Ocean Springs and was plowing one day, and he hits the stone. He digs it up and he sees Iberville's name on it and everything. This is the first thing that Iberville did to prove that the continent, or the center of the continent, was French territory. It stayed there all these years, and then he did this. His name was Robert Rupp, and he found this in 1916. He kept it for 4 years, then he gave it to his son-in-law, who was a lighthouse keeper at Madisonville, and Frederick kept the stone for 19 years in his house, his lighthouse house, housekeeper's house. And then when he retired, he donated to Louisiana State Museum, where it rests today. The story of the lighthouse system on the Gulf Coast is it's about families, and it starts off with a family. Bienville takes his crew and he goes up and he establishes Fort Lewis in 1702 and a settlement called Old Mobile. And now, to get to that, they had to go through enter Mobile Bay and go up the river 27 miles. The trouble is, there were sandbars in front of the bay. They did have a channel, which was meters, they call them there, but 15 feet in depth, where large boats could get through. So when reading this history and everything about the boats coming in after 1702 with the casket girls and other people, they could use this channel. But Bienville, we don't know exactly when, but he told a man named Joseph Simon de la Pointe, who was with him from the beginning, but he stayed on Dauphin Island, lived on that. And he didn't go up to Fort Lewis then. Bienville told him to set up some lighthouses, because he knew that he must have known that Joseph Simon de la Pointe had a little interest in it and knowledge about lighthouse system. Why? Because he married the daughter of who was the daughter of a French admiral, the daughter or the granddaughter of a French admiral, and this French admiral obviously had knowledge of lighthouse systems. And this is it right here. The map says distinctly lighthouse. It said it was printed in Paris in 1718, but I don't know what they meant by the word lighthouse. I assume that it was a mechanism to guide the boats over these shoals into Mobile Bay, which had enough water to take the boats. But anyway, this is what got my interest. If this map was drawn in 1718, it's possible, it's likely that this it was drawn by a surveyor, somebody over here, either in 1707 when Bienville moved his headquarters down from the river to Mobile Bay, or in 1710. But anyway, it's either 6 or 9 years older than Boston Harbor. So, show this map. It shows you where Fort Lewis and where Mobile Bay and the entrance to Mobile Bay there. And this is other map that's more clearly, well, they had to worry about these shallow shoals or the ships couldn't get into the Mobile Bay. I read an article in the paper that Joseph Simon was the brother of this Duchess Chaumont in France, the Duchess. She must have been very friendly with the king because the king gave her a large grant at Pascagoula. And the government, the ministers asked him to build a fort to protect her property at Pascagoula. So he goes down. First of all, he starts a lighthouse system, and then he works on these a building, which wasn't a fort, but it became a house, the Pointe Krebs house. And he built that, and he lived there for several years. In 1730, his daughter, one of his daughters, marries Hugo Krebs. And I have a lot of information in volume 14 on the Krebs, how he was born in Germany, and he came over to the colony, French colony. But he marries a La Pointe girl, and he helps with a lot of the finished construction and living at the, today is a museum there. It's called the La Pointe Krebs House, and I have all, you can find out the information by going on the internet. But anyway, so he associates the Krebs, they have 5 children, and they're living with Joseph Simon de la Pointe. His wife dies in about 1751. And of course, he was making trips to New Orleans, which was established in 1718. When he was in New Orleans, he met this Mariana Chauvin de Joyce, who was from the Illinois country. They were down on business, but her mother died there. So Mariana marries Hugo Krebs. Actually, she turns out to be, to my surprise, a Ciano, which is my direct line. Her grandfather was Louis Ciano, and my great 4 greats grandfathers was Louis Ciano also. She's my direct line, and her family is going to be very important in the establishment of a lighthouse at the mouth of the Tchefuncte River as I get into the story. But anyway, they had a war called the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. Britain was victorious. They captured Havana, and on the Navy they beat the French Navy, and Spain was the allies of France, but they lost. So they get in the peace treaty settlement, they get the Florida parishes, the North Shore, and from 1763 from 1763 to 1783, they were the owners of the Florida parishes. And the British settlers came. I made a trip to London in 1980 and went to Kew Gardens, the archives, and I dug up about 45 land grants on the Tchefuncte River and the Lake Pontchartrain, Bayou Castan, and Bayou Chinchuba. But anyway, the American Revolution changed all that. Of course, Spain was allied with us and so forth. So the American colonists were victorious and the British had to leave. Most of the settlers on the Tchefuncte River, all of them left. And our story starts with the Bahams. The Bahams were first sighted on the Gefuncto River after his wife died. He had 6 kids, but one of them died. He came over to New Orleans. He was at Mobile, and he had a place. He was from France, the Bordeaux region. The Bahams were wine growers and family. But anyway, he first got a plantation on the Mobile, up there on the river north of Mobile. But after his wife died, he came over to New Orleans in 1783, early 1783, and he asked for a land grant. Governor Miro, Stephen Miro, gave him 1,000 arpents, 800 acres, on the Gefuncto River, 2.5 miles up on the left bank. And this started the settlements on the Gefuncto River. And but getting back to Hugo couldn't. He signed an oath of allegiance to the British over at Pascagoula, but after a few years he had enough. Hugo had a scientific mind. A botanist noticed that Hugo developed a machine to pick cotton, and it's documented that he was the first one to invent a cotton-picking machine. A man with this talent back in the 1760s must have had a good mind, scientific mind, and he probably knew what Joseph Simon LaPointe did with these lighthouses, setting up these lighthouses, with the lamps, used to light the lamps and everything. The average person had candles in their house. They didn't have lanterns or lighthouses like were developed for the maritime system. But anyway, he must have given some of this knowledge to his wife, Mariana Chauvin, and his son, Basil. They had 6 kids. But after a few years in 1773, Hugo had enough. He left everything over there and took his family and came to New Orleans. He died in 1776. The widow, Marianne Chauvin, and her family lived in New Orleans for a few years, but the Gefuncto River, after the war, was starting to fill up. The Bahams came. Another widow, Catherine Montlemont, her father was a favorite with the Indians. She asked for a land grant in 1784 up the Gefuncto, about 8 miles at the breaks in the river up there, and she got a land grant there. They had Dominic Jung, who wanted to start a cattle ranch. Charles Parent, whose ancestor was one of the 4 families that settled Mobile, was appointed commandant of the Gefuncto River. His wife, Jean Rochon, was from another family of the 4 families that helped settle the first settlement, which became Mobile at Mobile Bay. But anyway, in 1790, Marianne Chauvin went to the governor and said she wanted a land grant over on the Gefuncto River. Now, high land and good land was all up the river there, past the Bahams. She could have easily have gotten land next to the other widow, Montlamont, who was a widow, Baden. She married Joseph Baden, and he died, and she became a widow, and she had children. But she was, the Indians allowed her to settle up the river there and did not disturb her. But the point is, other people were getting land grants up the river, but no, Mary Ann Chauvin said, no, I want a piece of the river at the mouth, where it's sandy and shells and everything. Why in the world would she want that as a land grant on low land which flooded and so forth? She still had a house in New Orleans, granted, but she did build a house and established on the mouth of the river. Her son, a few years later, who was in his 20s, Basil, goes to the governor and says, I want to get 31 a land grant on the western side of the river. He had in mind, they must have had in mind the lighthouses that were developed at Mobile. They had to. But anyway, they acquired these Spanish land grants. And this is the beginning of what will become the lighthouse at Madisonville. Anyway, the next thing that happened, of course, was the purchase, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and Governor Claiborne comes into the picture. He was a young man who was a minister working for the government in Tennessee and so forth, and he was appointed governor of the new territory of the 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. But he found out that he got there were many problems. And to get information and contacting Washington, you had to take a boat all the way around Florida, and it would take a long time when the boat left. So he thought the mail system was starting to operate back east, and he decided to see if he couldn't get permission to get a mail route from Washington to Spanish territory and to wind up at the end on the Gefuncte River. So he, this in 1804, he had this idea, but it wasn't until 1805 when Captain Daniel Cormick of the U.S. Marines and 300 Marines came down to New Orleans and were stationed there. The government realized they had to have some authority in New Orleans. These 300 Marines were put on the West Bank, but Governor Claiborne asked Captain Cormick would he go across the lake and negotiate with the Spanish. He was successful, and they gave him permission to run the mail route through Georgia, Mississippi, and across the Pearl River to the Gefuncto, and have a depot on the Gefuncte River above the Bayham, right by the Bayhams, by a big oak. It was later called Post Oak. And this was one of the major events that happened. A few years later, they put out a mail contract for a captain in a boat to get the mail across the lake as swiftly as possible. Entered Captain William Collins. His brother, younger brother, John Warden Collins, had a store on what was Magazine Street by the river, and they were dealing with a lot of flatboats coming down the river. It was very successful. But anyway, Captain William Collins decided that became in the shipping industry, sailor, and he worked his way up, and he became a captain. And from Liverpool to New Orleans, he made several trips with ships. But he decided that he would apply for this contract. So he did get the contract in 1810. What was happening at the time, there was a problem with entering Bayou St. John. It only had 3 feet of water at low tide, and the boats couldn't come in. In 1808, Congress decided to do something about it and appropriated money to establish a lighthouse at Bayou St. John. It wasn't erected until 1810 and put into service. Captain William Collins needed this because it took at least 12 hours with a good wind across the lake. We know this because Major Tatum, who was with General Jackson, wrote in his book that they aborted this mail packet and that they left early in the morning, one morning, and did not arrive at St. John, Bayou St. John, until well after 8 o'clock at night. It was dark. So there was a problem of getting over this shoal, so they needed a light. A lighthouse was started and it was active in 1811. When he would get the mail, his route was to the Tchefuncte River, but the Tchefuncte River had a problem too. It had sandbars, and I have a statement where one of the Presbyterian ministers in 1823 came to Madisonville, to St. Tammany, and he said there was only 5 feet of water to cross the bore, and you had to be very careful entering into the river. But anyway, Collins had a problem. He could be wrecked on a sandbar. He had to get his course as fast as he could. Now, who had the land where a possible lighthouse could be installed? It happened to be Basil Krebs. And he had this land from 1795. In 1804, he solidifies his ownership with Surveyor General David Bannister Morgan and his partner Thomas Fenton. With the purchase of 1803, there was a mad rush, a frenzied rush for land across Lake Pontchartrain. And they couldn't get enough surveyors to do the request. The Surveyor General stated that he was 100 requests behind. So they asked David Bannister Morgan and his partner, Thomas Fenton, who up in Natchez, surveying Natchez, to come down and work for them and survey some of these requests on the North Shore. One of his surveys that he did on the North Shore was survey the land for Basil Krebs. And in 1804, him and his partner, Fenton, surveyed his land, and I have this map in my hand that you can see. It's very important. This is where the lighthouse is going to be. In 1811, he starts his run. He moves over and gets a house, a home in Bayham Village. He gets married, has a child called George Collins. So for 5 years, he makes these fast runs. He even took General Jackson in tape. Madame Marianne Chauvin did get another piece of land on it. She applied in 1804 to the governor and the intendant, Juan Morales, and she received a grant of 600 and something acres on the east bank, a few miles up the river of the Tchefuncte River. But she never really got to do anything with it because she made a will out in 1799 which is I have in the book here, Madame Chauvin's will, but she died in 1811. Her son, Basil, of course, took over the land and everything. And when Collins went over there and said, look, I have to have some kind of, when I come in the dark, I have to have some kind of direction to get into the river. This is what I'm assuming, and it's my judgment from the facts, and which I will explain. But Basil Krebs set up the first, some kind of lighthouse system. Crude as it could have been a wooden tower, 8 or 10, 12 feet tall, with a lantern on it at the top. But lo and behold, Basil dies in 1815. And here comes William Collins. On a December night, a storm came up. Now, whether they had a lighthouse going or not, we don't know. But William Collins was killed in a crash of his boat on the North Shore in a storm. How do we know? There's a court case 103, that was taking place in 1830. This was before 1837 now. And the Coast Guard record said this is the year that we established a light, 1830. Anyway, in this court case of 1830, there was a man called Moses Moore who came down and started living he had a house by the Tchefuncte River, and he also got land at Bedico. Started lumbering and he started building. But anyway, he gets in on this trial of 1830, 103, which, by the way, is the son of William Collins, George Collins, then 19, coming back from Texas, suing to get his inheritance back, the land that his father had and everything, that was started by fraud by the Judge James Tate, who married his mother. But anyway, he sued Lyman Briggs, who was a very important person there, who owned the land at the time. He didn't get the land back. But anyway, Moses Moore said, yes, I was there in 1816 when the boy was 5 years old, and his father was killed, drowned, off the shore of the mouth of the river, off the lighthouse. Now, this was in 1830. If they had a lighthouse there in 1830, there must have been a lighthouse sooner. In the Coast Guard records, there is a statement that in 1827, 3 years earlier, there's a lighthouse there. So my assumption is that Captain William Collins, made an agreement with Hugo Krebs, who had in his mind all along about a lighthouse, which they got from their father, who was a partner of Joseph Simon de la Pointe, who established the first lighthouse probably in North America. That is important history. But anyway, this is the start of that. Felicia Marchand took over the land after Basil died. And she has an interesting story too. Her family, she had a brother called Eugene Marchand, who married a woman whose last name was Bellucci. And Rene Bellucci was one of the principal lieutenants of Jean Lafitte. He became the admiral of down in Venezuela, Boulevard, Simon Boulevard, and he died there. But anyway, that's another interesting story. The point is, the first lighthouse was started at Mobile Bay, sometime between 1702 and 1718 when we see lighthouse written on the map. My opinion is, in judgment, that it was Bienville had La Pointe started in 1707 when they started Mobile Bay, when they moved down from Fort Lewis and Old Mobile. And it's all in my book here. The lighthouse and Felicia Marchand purchased, anyway, her brother, Jean Marchand, bought land north of the Madisonville, Bayhams, and it started the cemetery there. And the cemetery, of course, has a lot of history in it. But anyway, in 1837, they started the lighthouse, and they started lighthouse keeping. They hired people for lighthouse keeping. There were 19 men between 1837 and 1939 who were the keepers. And that's part of the story there of the lighthouse. But going back, we have a picture in the book. It was called the Civil War. Of course, you know Farragut taking over New Orleans and everything, but they would send troops and expeditions across the lake. And because the law, they had still had Southern sympathizers and troops over there that would still on the war side for the Southerners. But anyway, the expeditions across the lake sometimes got very brutal. They would kill people's cattle, burn their homes. A gunboat came and we talked the lighthouse and start shelling the lighthouse. And I have a picture of the lighthouse from the court records, how it looked before it was destroyed by the cannons of the Union Army. It was the same design, conical, made of brick and so forth. And the top part, which had the light system, was a little different. And when they rebuilt the lighthouse in 1867, they made it a little taller. But that's part of the history. But like I said, the lighthouse, and we have 19 men, starting with Benjamin Thurston in 1837 to 1845. David Bannister Morgan was deaf at the time. He was old, but he had a son, David Morgan Jr., who was the second lighthouse keeper from 1845 to 1847. And we had the third one, Warren Curdes, Wharton Batten, Javier Daniel, James Bradley, Dempson Gorman, William Fletcher, Moses Crider, William Stewart, Louis Johnson, Bernard Sergestein, Vincent Scosa, Bernard Sergestein again, William Tennant, Joseph Javoda, Henry Brower, and Frederick Schreiber in 1920 to 1935. The last lighthouse keeper was 1939 to 1940 by the name of William Still. I told you an interesting story about Frederick Schreiber, that his father-in-law, Robert Krupp, had a place on Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and he was plowing the ground around his house one day, and he hit this stone there. He dug it up, and I don't know if he realized what it was, but he kept it, and he gave it to his son-in-law, who was a lighthouse keeper at Madisonville. That stone was in the keeper's lighthouse at home for 19 years, and whatever. And when Schreiber finished his term, it's like he gave it to the Louisiana State Museum. It started with Joseph Simon de la Pointe sometime early in the 1700s on orders of Bienville, the first lighthouse system. 100 years later, Basil Krebs worked out an agreement with William Collins. He was running the fast packet, mail packet back, and he needed the lighthouse. Something happened. Either the storm knocked the lighthouse, the lamps. By the way, they were using crude lamps. In the meantime, of course, the lighthouses were appearing all over the place. Lake Pontchartrain had a system of lighthouses. The lighthouse at the Tchefuncte River is part of that system. 9 named lighthouses around the lakes. Bayou St. John was first in 1811. And then it looked like the New Canal Lighthouse, 1832. East Wrigley's Lighthouse, 1833. Pass Manchac, 1837. Bonfouca Lighthouse, 1848. West Wrigley's, 1855. Of course, 1837, we have the Gefuncto River Lighthouse. The lighthouse, of course, was rebuilt after the Civil War. It was destroyed. And even today, it's a symbol of the North Shore. It's an icon. It was the last thing about the mouth of the river. And Fritz Janke came from Germany in the 1880s or something, a young man. He was very industrious and a hard worker, and he saw the need for sidewalks in New Orleans. So little by little, he got into the sand and gravel business, and he was the one that started to make concrete sidewalks for New Orleans. Janke had some sons. One of them was Ernest, and World War I came along, and Ernest had contacts in Washington, D.C. with the Navy Secretary. He got a contract to build wooden ships. And he started buying up the land. He had the means of digging out the shallow sandbars in the mouth of the river. To get those boats, even that was not enough. But he dug out, with his machines and everything, and dredged, what you call it, the sand at the mouth of the, and you can see in the picture where the sand was deposited on the left bank where Basil Krebs had that 31 acres, and also on the mouth of the river, the east bank, above where Madame Chauvin had her house. So they dug out the channel, made it deeper, and deposited the sand both on the west bank and the east bank. But even this was not enough for those ships. They had to put a pontoon, and 2 of the ships were finished and floated out. And how to get them out, they put a pontoon in the back end of the ship where all the weight was, and waved it and got it over the bar. So the Jankes would be the last part of the story of the mouth of the river and the lighthouse and how the ships got in and out safely. There were 3 museums who entered the story. The Lake Pontchartrain Basin Maritime Museum and Research Center. The Pascagoula La Pointe Krebs House has a museum. I contacted the man there, Dwayne Coates. He almost fell off his chair when I told him I had the lighthouse became over on the Tchefuncte River, and of course the first lighthouse from that map that we see, at least it said, the map says it was printed in 1718. So here you have some important history about the North Shore area of Lake Pontchartrain. If you want more material, go to my collection at the Southeastern University. I hope you enjoyed our talk. Thank you.